I will read James 4, verse number 1. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? Last week we looked at the question, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? And today we're going to look at how James begins to answer that question. He says simply in verse 1, is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? The word passions there is hedone, where we get the word hedonism from. It means strong desires, physical pleasures. It usually comes with a negative connotation, pointing to pleasures that have become ends in themselves. So usually seeking what is we usually think of as the physical pleasures, and linking pleasures. This term hedone to conflict is not something that James himself comes up with. There is a tradition of this. In the book of 4th Maccabees, chapter 1, we find these verses. There exists in pleasure, and the word for pleasure here is also the same hedone. There exists in pleasure a malicious disposition, which is the most complex of all the affections. In the soul, it is arrogance, love of money, thirst for honor, and contention. In the body, it is greediness, indiscriminate eating, and solitary gluttony. So James is working from a tradition that sees contention and malicious dispositions come linked to a strong desire for pleasures, and pleasures that are seeking themselves as an end. Now, I've said probably 1,000 times since we started this study of James that James's overarching theme is wholeness and undivided devotion to God, not being distracted by other things in the world or pursuing them, but having a sole focus on being whole and complete in God. And one cannot push for this idea without at some point dealing with desires and pleasures in this world. We are far more driven by our desires, our passions, our pleasures than we like to admit. We like to think of ourselves as being reasonable beings, making our decisions and moving about in the world based on our reason. But this is not, for the most part, true. The vast majority of us are more moved by our loves, our desires, than we would like to admit. We are affective beings. And this in itself is not a bad thing. We tend to think of it a bad thing, especially over the past few centuries. It's become, with the elevation of reason, we tend to think of this bad, but it is not. What is bad is when our desires, our pleasures are in conflict and are not directed towards God. God, we go back to chapter 1, verses 5 and 8, where James says that those who lack wisdom must ask in faith, not wavering like a wave tossed about by the sea. And James is pointing once again. We remember we said that it's not a intellectual doubt that he's pointing to, but rather a division of devotion. The one who is double-minded, unstable in all his ways, the one who wants God, but not at the expense of pleasures in life, wants God to be a God among other gods rather than his sole desire in life. This is especially important for us here today, those of us living in America, 21st century America. We live in a setting that has seemingly limitless supply of pleasure. The There are unending options for pleasing ourselves. There may have been other civilizations that have had this in the past, but we certainly are marked by our drive for pleasure. And no matter how strong we are, there are few humans with unfettered access to pleasure that won't fall into some sort of idolatry. We are just not strong enough in most cases. And even in some ways, in the complete rejection of all pleasure by some becomes a form of idolatry, being marked by a rejection of all pleasure. It's still a life defined by what it rejects. More than that, we are pressured to fully sate ourselves in pleasure. Pursuing any desire that we can find is a right. Pleasing ourselves is a duty that we must pursue in our society. If for no other reason, and there are many other reasons that are given to us, for no other reason that we must consume to keep the economy going. We'd have to spend our money consuming things, pleasing ourselves to generate jobs and wealth for everyone, and it's our duty to do so. And anyone who cannot get what they want or can't pursue all their desires or doesn't have access to some pleasure is not just unfortunate in our society, they are abused. It is abuse not to be able to pursue whatever pleasure, whatever desire that we have. To be honest, there are times when I long to live in a place where options for pleasure are very limited, where unfettered pursuit of what I want is not a right or duty or a responsibility. Life was harder then. It was more frustrating a lot of times, but I do wonder sometimes if life wasn't better under those circumstances. We struggle with pleasures. In some ways, it kills much of what we should, and it is hard to be fully devoted to God in a world that pushes so heavily pleasures upon us. Now, in all that I'm saying, I am not, as I said a minute ago, there is a possibility of being defined by pleasure in its rejection of it as well in asceticism. God gave us pleasures. He wants us indeed to enjoy the world that he gave us. But we are not to be in a full throated pursuit of pleasures at all expenses. We are to enjoy them as gifts from God, but still worship God alone. When I think of these things, the example that comes that I would want to have most for my life is that of a hobbit. Tolkien writes that one thing that marks a hobbit is that more than any other creature, they knew how to enjoy good things. They knew how to enjoy the good things of life, good food, good drink, the pleasures of life. But if you took all of it away from them, all pleasures away from them, they would be fine. They'd be happy. Their life wasn't dependent on it. And that is the way I think we should be. When we are given pleasures by God, we enjoy them, but not as gods. We don't seek them out fervently. We enjoy them as they come. And when they go, we still have God, the true source of our delight and joy and our true love. So these passions, these pleasures, these strong desires, James says, are in conflict within us because we cannot control them like the tongue. We cannot control them when we pursue them. as idols. And he says that this causes wars within you. He says it causes wars within you. And there's two ways to see this. One, it may be saying that the wars, the you there is in the body, the church. So it causes wars between the members of the church. My desire is in conflict with your desire. And since my passions have become indispensable for me and your passions are indispensable for you, when we want the same thing, we both can't have it. We're in conflict. We cannot put each other's needs and desires before our own, sacrificing ourselves for the other. We cannot consider I cannot consider your needs and your desires more important than my own. So we fight and we quarrel. The other way of taking this is to say that the passions at war raging are not between individuals, but in one individual. So in my own self, I have these raging passions at war with one another, fighting against one another, sort of tearing myself apart. My disparate passions and desires are tossing within me like waves in the ocean, tearing and pulling me apart. We may think here of Paul in Romans chapter number 7, saying, in this case, I know what I should do. I know what's good and right. And I just can't do it. I have this sort of war raging inside of me between what I know I should do but what I really, really want to do in the flesh. And so I've got this raging war inside of me that causes problems and issues, not just in me, but that spills out into the body itself as well. Both interpretations are fine. They work. I think both interpretations are true. And I think it is fine to see either one in this passage. It is certainly the case that my passions inside of me cause problems, and that does spill out into those around me. And certainly passions in a corporate body when they are at odds with one another and we are unable to consider one another first. It leads to wars and fightings and quarrels among us too. So James is going to go to war here against these devotion to passions. And he's going to give us, in the next few verses, he'll continue to look at what he's talking about with passions at war. And then he's going to give us some advice on how not to be at war with one another, how to handle these passions that are raging within us. And so we'll get to those over the next few verses. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.